In early 1943, the Pacific War entered its decisive phase. After more than a year of rapid conquest, the Japanese Empire began to feel the full weight of the Allied counteroffensive. Tokyo's once unstoppable victories, which had expanded its reach from the Philippines to the Solomon Islands and even the shores of the Indian Ocean, were now being blunted. At Guadalcanal, after 6 brutal months of fighting, U.S. Marines held the strategic island, forcing Japan to withdraw in February 1943. It was Japan's first major land defeat in the Pacific, a crack signaling the turning of the tide. On the map, New Guinea and the Bismarck Archipelago formed a long barrier between Allied bases in Australia and Japanese strongholds in the Central Pacific. Whoever controlled this island chain would dominate the corridor linking Australia and the Philippines. Thus, after the loss of Guadalcanal, Japan's Imperial General Staff resolved to hold this region at all costs, especially the port of Lae on New Guinea's northern coast. Lae, located on Huon Gulf, occupied a key position from which Japan could threaten Allied supply routes between Australia and the U.S. while shielding its massive air naval base at Rabaul on New Britain, the fortress of Japan's Southwest Pacific defense. If Lae fell, Rabaul would be isolated, and the entire New Guinea front would collapse. At the start of 1943, Japan's Lae garrison numbered about 6,000 troops, mainly from the 18th Division, exhausted by months of jungle warfare, malaria, and supply shortages. Tokyo ordered an urgent reinforcement, the battle-hardened 51st Division, veterans of the China Campaign, to be sent from Rabaul. The operation was codenamed Operation 81. Under the plan, 6,900 troops, along with 400 tons of cargo, ammunition, vehicles, and provisions, would sail aboard 8 transports escorted by 8 destroyers. The convoy would depart Rabaul, cross the Bismarck Sea, pass through the Vitiaz Strait, and land at Lae, a voyage of over 900 kilometers expected to take 3 days. Japanese commanders believed that the tropical storms of March would shield them from Allied reconnaissance. That confidence proved fatal. Throughout 1942, the Allies had steadily expanded their signals intelligence network. Thanks to the codebreakers of Frumel, Fleet Radio Unit Melbourne, and the Allied Intelligence Bureau, U.S. and Australian cryptanalysts had cracked most of the Imperial Navy's ciphers. By late February 1943, they knew nearly every detail of Operation 81, the departure date, convoy composition, and even the names of ship commanders. General George C. Kenney, commander of the U.S. 5th Air Force in New Guinea, recognized a golden opportunity. Destroying this convoy would sever Japan's logistical lifeline to Lae and demonstrate that air power alone could dominate the sea, a realm once ruled solely by naval fleets. Granted full authority, Kenney began coordinating a massive ambush involving U.S. Army Air Forces, the Royal Australian Air Force, RAAF, and maritime reconnaissance units. Meanwhile, the Japanese remained convinced that stormy weather would conceal them. On the night of February 28, 1943, the convoy quietly departed Rabaul. Leading the formation were the destroyers Shirayuki, Arashio, Asashio, and Tokitsukaze, followed by the transports Kyokusei Maru, Oigawa Maru, Ayo Maru, Teiyo Maru, Taimei Maru, Nojima Maru, Shinai Maru, and Kembu Maru, all carrying soldiers confident they would soon reach Lae in triumph. High above, American B-24 Liberator reconnaissance planes were already circling, using coordinates supplied by intelligence. They waited for a clear break in the weather to accidentally spot the convoy, disguising the fact that the Allies already knew everything. In early March, the Bismarck Sea was racked by squalls and thunderstorms, grounding many flights. But at dawn on March 2, 1943, the skies cleared. Allied scouts spotted the Japanese convoy near the Vitiaz Strait. A coded message flashed to Port Moresby. Convoy sighted. Kenney immediately ordered a full strike. Dozens of squadrons scrambled. High-altitude B-17 flying Fortresses, medium B-25 Mitchells, and low-flying Beaufighters from the RAF. Crews fueled, armed, and checked their guns. Few realized they were about to fight one of the most dramatic air-sea battles of the Pacific War. At Rabaul, Japanese officers believed their convoy was proceeding as planned. Escort ships increased their vigilance, but none suspected they were already in the crosshairs of dozens of Allied squadrons. Reports of distant enemy aircraft were dismissed as minor scouting activity. At Port Moresby, however, Kenney and his Australian advisors were refining a revolutionary tactic. In the preceding months, Major Paul "Pappy" Gunn, a former civilian pilot, had modified B-25s by mounting heavy machine guns in their noses, turning them into deadly low-level attackers. Pilots were trained in skip bombing, dropping bombs from very low altitude so they would skip across the water and detonate against a ship's hull. Adapted from techniques used by Australian pilots in the Mediterranean, this would be its first large-scale test in the Pacific. Kenney believed this was the perfect chance to prove the method's worth. He wrote in his diary, "If this attack succeeds, we won't need warships to control the sea anymore." On March 2nd, high-altitude B-17 struck first, forcing the Japanese convoy to scatter and slow down. One transport, Kyokusei Maru, was hit directly and sank that morning, taking hundreds of soldiers with her. Yet the remaining ships pressed on, determined to reach Leh by the next day. As Allied pilots readied for the decisive blow, Japanese officers began to sense danger. The destroyer Shirayuki reported enemy aircraft appearing frequently, moving in large formations. Still, they believed the attacks were limited reconnaissance and that Japanese air units from Leh would soon provide cover. In reality, Japan's air power in the area had been severely depleted and could offer no real protection. By dusk on March 2nd, signal lamps blinked calmly across the Japanese decks as sailors kept watch in the cold night air, trusting that the coming storm would hide them from the enemy's eyes. They did not know that above the horizon, dozens of B-25s, B-17s, and Beaufighters were refueling, waiting for dawn to unleash hell. When the sun rose on March 3, 1943, the convoy steamed between Leh and Umboy Island, thin trails of smoke stretching across the deep blue sea. It was the last moment of calm, for within hours the entire fleet would be engulfed in fire. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea had begun. When the reconnaissance message reached Port Moresby at dawn on March 2, 1943, General George C. Kenney knew the moment he had waited for had finally arrived. The terse words, "Convoy sighted, heading southeast," sent a surge of energy through headquarters like a hive coming alive. After months of patient preparation, all the elements were in place: accurate intelligence, favorable weather, and a target large enough to prove that air power could replace naval fleets in controlling the sea. Kenney was not the kind of general who stayed behind a desk. A former combat pilot, he had flown with fighter squadrons in Europe before being assigned by General Douglas MacArthur to command the 5th Air Force in the Southwest Pacific. When he first arrived, he was appalled by the disarray: poor bases, worn-out aircraft, muddy airstrips, and demoralized crews. But Kenney possessed two rare qualities: tactical creativity and an unshakable faith in technology. He believed that, if properly organized, an air force could destroy any fleet without a single warship. In January 1943, he established a special group to develop low-level attack tactics, led by Major Paul "Pappy" Gunn, a former civilian pilot, brilliant engineer and fearless rule-breaker. Working in a workshop at Townsville, Gunn and his crew transformed the standard B-25 Mitchell medium bomber into a new kind of weapon. They removed the Norden bomb sight, reinforced the nose, and mounted 4 50-caliber machine guns on each side, plus 4 more in the nose, creating an 8-gun forward battery. Some variants even carried a 75mm cannon, turning the bomber into a hybrid between a flying fortress and a torpedo boat. The idea was met with skepticism. Many senior officers considered low-altitude attacks on ships suicidal. Japanese anti-aircraft guns, especially the deadly Type 96 25mm, were notoriously accurate at close range. But Gunn and Kenney persisted. They argued that if aircraft flew extremely low, below 100 feet, the ship's guns couldn't lower their barrels fast enough, while the B-25's forward firepower could sweep the decks clean before the enemy could respond. At the same time, another bold tactic was being tested: skip bombing. The concept was simple but daring. Bombs would be released at altitudes of just a few dozen meters, fitted with delayed fuses of 4 to 5 seconds. On impact, the bomb would skip once or twice across the water like a stone on a pond, then slam into the ship's side or detonate just below the hull. Instead of precision vertical hits, pilots could aim straight at the target's flank. Early tests near Port Moresby produced astonishing results, up to 80% direct hits, many times more effective than traditional high-altitude bombing. Pilots who trained in the new technique never forgot the feeling. They flew so low that sea spray lashed their windshields, and the roar of the engines merged with the surf. It felt like piloting a speedboat with wings, one recalled. You could see the faces of the dummy crew on deck when the bomb hit the water and bounced. The skill demanded courage, flawless coordination, and nerves of steel, qualities forged in the Pacific's long missions and brutal air battles. Once the Japanese convoy's position was confirmed, Kenney ordered every available aircraft to battle readiness. At Port Moresby, Dobodura, and nearby forward fields, planes were rolled out of hangars, refueled, loaded with bombs, and their guns tested. More than 100 aircraft were mobilized, B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators for high-altitude strikes, B-25 Mitchells and A-20 Bostons for low-level attacks, Beaufighters and P-38 Lightnings for escort and anti-flak suppression. The Royal Australian Air Force, RAAF, took charge of reconnaissance and the initial strike phase. On the evening of March 2nd, in the operations room at Port Moresby, Kenney briefed his squadron leaders one last time. On the wall map, the convoy's route, traced in red, cut across the Bismarck Sea, hugging the north coast of New Guinea toward Lae. The Allied strike paths, drawn in blue, converged from 3 directions: north from Port Moresby, east from Dobodura, and west from Buna. The attack plan had 3 phases: reconnaissance and harassment, medium-altitude bombing, and a final low-level annihilation strike. First, B-17s would bomb from about 2,000 meters, forcing the convoy to scatter and zigzag. Next, B-25s and Beaufighters would dive to 30 to 60 meters, raking decks with machine gun fire before releasing skip bombs to sink the transports. Finally, A-20s would sweep the area, finishing off any burning or crippled ships. Kenney ended the briefing with a short, chilling line: "Tomorrow we'll show them who owns the Bismarck Sea." That night, the Port Moresby base hardly slept. Mechanics worked under dim lamps, wiping oil from guns, tightening bolts, hanging bombs. The air smelled of gasoline, smoke, and sweat. Pilots sat around metal tables, sipping thick coffee and rereading their orders in silence. Some scribbled quick letters to wives or sweethearts, folding them into envelopes and handing them to comrades. "If I don't come back, give this to her." None spoke the words aloud, but everyone knew. By sunrise, some of them would not return. At dawn on March 3, 1943, mist still clung to the tropical hills as the first Pratt & Whitney engines thundered to life. The lead formations of B-17s lifted off, loaded with 500-pound bombs, heading toward the Bismarck Sea. Behind them came the B-25s and Beaufighters, olive-gray warbirds bearing the white tail insignia of the 5th Air Force. In their cockpits, pilots adjusted goggles and tightened harnesses. "Good weather," one said over the radio. "Seas smooth as glass." They didn't know that below them, 16 Japanese warships and transports were steaming exactly where Kenney had predicted. From the RAF's base at Milne Bay, scouts radioed confirmation. The convoy was midway to Lae, about 150 miles out, in double-column formation, slowed by evasive maneuvers under distant B-17 bombardment. Just as planned, the high-altitude strikes were breaking the convoy's order, clearing the way for the low-level assault. Back at Port Moresby, Kenney stood before the operations map, a half-burned cigarette between his fingers, listening to radio reports minute by minute. He knew that within hours, the fate of the entire campaign, and perhaps his own reputation, would be decided. But before the B-25s arrived, the sky over the Bismarck Sea was already erupting. From above, B-17 crews saw streaks of white, the trails of Japanese anti-aircraft fire exploding amid the clouds. Below, the transports churned black smoke, columns of water leaping skyward as bombs splashed around them. The convoy twisted and turned, leaving vast spirals of wake across the sea. Behind the lines, ground crews prepped aircraft for the second wave, tools clanking under the roar of engines. No one spoke of fear, but the air was taut as wire. On the wall, a photo of General MacArthur watched over them, cold and determined. Beneath it, in Kenney's own handwriting, was the motto, "Hit hard, hit fast, hit low." Those tense hours were the culmination of every effort, every innovation, every belief that human ingenuity could shift the balance of war. As the B-25s roared down the runways, the earth shook and dust billowed. They flew northeast, toward the Japanese ships still sailing under the illusion that the sky was theirs. Within a few hours, the Bismarck Sea would be turned into a sea of fire. At dawn on March 3, 1943, the sky over the Bismarck Sea was a rare, cloudless blue. Wisps of white floated on the horizon, and sunlight poured down onto a sea as flat and reflective as glass. Yet beneath that calm surface lay one of the most brutal naval massacres of the Pacific War, the Japanese convoy. 8 transport ships escorted by 8 destroyers was under the command of Admiral Masatomi Kimura, steaming southeast about 150 miles from Leh. Aboard were more than 6,900 troops of the 51st Division, Japan's main reinforcement force to defend New Guinea against MacArthur's offensive. Kimura had received reports the previous evening that Allied reconnaissance planes had spotted them, but he remained confident. Japan's Navy and Air Force, he believed, could shield the convoy from any attack launched from Port Moresby. On his flagship Shirayuki, Kimura remained composed. "We'll reach Leh before they can muster enough strength." But General George C. Kenney had been waiting for this moment for months. At 10 a.m., the first formation of B-17 flying fortresses appeared at 2,000 meters, slicing through the clear sky. From below, Japanese sailors saw small black dots moving in perfect formation before the low, rolling thunder of engines reached them. Alarm sirens wailed across the convoy. Gunners scrambled to their stations as anti-aircraft guns swung upward. Moments later, 500-pound bombs rained down, turning the tranquil sea into boiling chaos. Great geysers of water shot skyward, drenching the decks. High-altitude bombing rarely hit moving ships, but it achieved exactly what Kenney intended, to force the convoy to scatter and break its tight defensive formation, clearing the way for the low-level assault to come. 15 minutes later, a deeper, closer roar grew along the horizon. The B-25 Mitchells and Bow fighters were coming in. Leading the charge was Lieutenant Colonel Ed Larner, commander of the 90th Squadron. He gave the order over radio. "Drop to the deck. Target, lead transport. Prepare for skip bombing." The formation instantly dropped to just 50 feet, barely 15 meters above the waves. The sea seemed to rush up to meet them. Spray lashed against their canopies. The Bow fighters struck first. Serving as path clearers, they dove head-on into the convoy, unleashing a torrent from their 4 20mm cannons and 6 machine guns, shredding decks and cutting down gunners before they could fire. Smoke and splinters erupted in their wake. As the Bow fighters pulled away, the B-25s roared in at 350 km/h, ready for their deadly skip-bombing runs. From only a few hundred meters out, the pilots pressed their release switches. A 500-pound bomb struck the surface, skipped once, then slammed directly into the side of the Kyokusei Maru. Seconds later, a thunderous explosion tore the ship in two. Flames and smoke shot hundreds of meters into the air as the vessel sank within minutes, taking hundreds of soldiers down with it. Over the radio, Larner's voice was calm. "Target hit. Moving to number 2. To the north, another B-25 section attacked the destroyer Arashio. Even after taking flak damage, one bomber pressed on, firing its 75mm cannon. One round struck the destroyer's stern, igniting the fuel tanks. The Arashio burst into flames, drifting out of formation and leaving a black trail across the sea. Survivors later recalled that the sky was so full of planes we could no longer see the sun. Each B-25 screamed, passed only meters above the masts, engines howling, guns blazing. The sea turned white with bullet splashes. Some Japanese gunners tried to return fire with their 25mm cannons, but most were wiped out before they could pull the trigger. By 11 a.m., as smoke blanketed the sea, Phase 2 began. A-20 Bostons from Dobadura swooped in to finish off what remained afloat. One bombed the Taimei Maru, striking it twice with skip bombs and setting it ablaze from bow to stern. Trapped Japanese soldiers leapt overboard, only to be engulfed by burning oil on the surface. Nearby, the destroyer Shikanami tried to rescue survivors, until a bomb struck it dead center, exploding in a fireball. Allied pilots would later describe the scene as a firestorm devouring the sea. The ocean had turned black with smoke and oil. Every few minutes, another column of fire rose skyward, each one marking a ship's death. By midday, the Japanese convoy was shattered. The transports were either sunk or burning wrecks, the rest drifting helplessly. Admiral Kimura, slightly wounded, ordered retreat with the few destroyers still able to move, but Allied aircraft stalked them relentlessly. P-38 Lightnings patrolled overhead, cutting down Japanese Zero fighters attempting to intervene. Of 8 fighters launched from Rabaul, only 3 made it back. By late afternoon, Kenney received the first report. 5 transports and 2 destroyers sunk, 3 others burning fiercely. But he was not finished. "We'll go back tomorrow morning," he said coldly. That night, flames still raged across the Bismarck Sea. Japanese crews tried desperately to pull survivors from the water, but most were burned or wounded beyond help. At dawn on March 4th, Allied aircraft returned, this time for strafing runs. They spent the morning circling and firing on lifeboats, wreckage, and survivors clinging to debris. The act would later spark controversy, but at the time, the goal was clear: ensure that no Japanese reinforcements ever reached New Guinea. By the afternoon, as the smoke cleared, the sea was strewn with charred wrecks, floating oil slicks, and countless bodies. Thousands of Japanese soldiers drifted lifeless in the waves, their life vests soaked in oil, rifles still clutched in their hands. Reconnaissance Catalinas flying overhead sent back a brief report. No survivors. The final tally was devastating. 8 transports and 4 destroyers sunk, with 3,500 Japanese troops killed and nearly 1,000 more lost on the retreat to Rabaul. Allied losses amounted to just 4 aircraft and 13 airmen, an almost unbelievable ratio for a battle of this scale. When the victory message reached Port Moresby, the entire base erupted in cheers. Kenney merely smiled, lit a cigarette, and told his aide, "We just rewrote how wars are fought at sea." General MacArthur, upon receiving the report, immediately cabled his congratulations. The results at the Bismarck Sea demonstrate that air power now commands the ocean. This marks a turning point in the Pacific War. In Tokyo, Japan's high command was stunned. Never before had a heavily escorted convoy been annihilated entirely by air power alone. Admiral Kimura survived but was harshly reprimanded, while the 51st Division, once expected to save Japan's fortunes in New Guinea, was virtually erased before ever setting foot ashore. Western newspapers called it the massacre on the Bismarck Sea. American front pages showed photos of B-25, Mitchell skimming over the water, burning ships below. Public opinion hailed it as proof of the new age of technology and of the revolutionary, low, fast, accurate tactics pioneered by Kenney and Pappy Gunn. Yet for many who took part, the memory was far from triumphal. Some pilots later admitted they were haunted by what they saw: Japanese soldiers floating in the flames, reaching up for help. "We were ordered to fire," one recalled. "We did. But flying home, all I felt was emptiness." In truth, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea was not only a military victory, but a strategic revolution. It proved that air power could dominate the sea, rendering traditional naval convoys obsolete. From then on, Japan was forced to move supplies only at night and in small groups, a desperate, inefficient measure. For the Allies, the triumph opened the door to the New Guinea campaign, bringing MacArthur one step closer to fulfilling his promise: "I shall return." On the evening of March 5, 1943, as Kenney stood on the Port Moresby airstrip watching his Mitchells return in the sunset glow, he knew it was not just a convoy that had been sunk, but an old way of war. Amid the smoke and fire of the Bismarck Sea, a new doctrine of warfare had been born, one in which the sky, not the ocean, would decide the fate of empires. When the sun set over the western horizon of the Bismarck Sea on March 4, 1943, the sky was still stained gray with the smoke of dozens of burning ships. Oil slicks stretched for miles, reflecting a sunset red as blood. Waves lapped rhythmically against drifting shards of steel, broken masts, overturned lifeboats, charred planks. Thousands of Japanese soldiers' bodies floated silently on the water, lifeless shadows beneath the crimson sky. The air reeked of oil, explosives, and death. The Bismarck Sea, once the lifeline of Japan's military transport routes, had become a vast graveyard. The battle lasted only 2 days, yet the scale of destruction exceeded all expectations. Of 8 transport ships, none survived. Of the 8 escorting destroyers, 4 were completely destroyed, 3 were severely damaged, and only Shiger remained operational. Despite multiple hits, Shiger managed to rescue several hundred survivors and retreat to Rabaul. The human losses were catastrophic. Over 3,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors were killed, most from the 51st Division. a key reinforcement force bound for New Guinea. Over 1,000 others were wounded or drowned while fleeing. Only about 200 were rescued, many gravely injured or exhausted. Survivors later recounted drifting for days, attacked by sharks and waves without food or fresh water. Some were picked up by Japanese destroyers, but most were left behind to avoid detection. Even by March 5th, bodies still floated on the oil-streaked sea, eyes wide open toward the sky, where Allied planes continued to patrol. For Japan, it was the greatest transport disaster since the Pacific War began. The consequences went far beyond the material losses. The 51st Division, meant to reinforce New Guinea, was virtually annihilated. Those who survived never regrouped into an effective fighting unit. Plans to strengthen Lae and Salamaua collapsed. Japan not only lost men and ships, but also the illusion that its convoys could cross these waters without being annihilated from the air. At Rabaul, somber silence filled the command meetings. Admiral Masatomi Kimura, commander of the convoy, survived but was wounded in the arm and severely reprimanded for underestimating the threat from the air. Yet senior officers knew Kimura alone was not to blame. The fault lay in the entire system, in the misguided belief that anti-aircraft guns and destroyer escorts could protect convoys from Allied air power. After the Bismarck Sea, they knew that era was over. In Tokyo, the Imperial General Staff had to concede there was no longer any safe transport route to New Guinea. From then on, troop and supply movements could only be carried out at night, in small groups of 1 or 2 ships, or covertly by submarine. This crippled Japan's logistics, leaving its New Guinea forces isolated, starving and exhausted through 1943-44. Many historians later called the defeat at the Bismarck Sea the decisive blow that severed Japan's supply artery in the South Pacific. Beyond manpower and ships, Japan also lost a massive quantity of material, hundreds of artillery pieces, trucks, thousands of tons of ammunition, fuel, and food, all meant for Lae, where Japanese forces were barely holding against Allied air raids. When those supplies never arrived, Japan's defensive line in New Guinea began to crumble. For the Allies, losses were minimal. Only 4 aircraft downed, with 13 airmen killed or missing. Given the scale and results, it was an overwhelming, near-perfect victory. Kenney telegraphed to MacArthur, "Japanese convoy completely destroyed. Not a single survivor reached Lae. 5th Air Force controls the Bismarck Sea." MacArthur read the report with rare satisfaction and declared to the press, "This battle proves that air power, properly employed, can control the seas. We have opened a new chapter in the history of warfare." From Canberra to Washington, the news spread like wildfire. American newspapers called it the Bismarck Sea Massacre. They printed images of B-25s skimming the waves, ships ablaze, and Japanese soldiers floating in the wreckage. After the dark years of Pearl Harbor and the fall of the Philippines, the American public found renewed pride. The battle became a symbol of the turning tide, when the initiative decisively passed to the Allies. Strategically, the consequences were immense. Japan's supply lines to New Guinea were crippled, isolating garrisons at Lae, Salamaua, Buna, and Wewak. When MacArthur launched his New Guinea offensive months later, the Japanese could barely resist. Those still alive suffered from malaria, hunger, and exhaustion. Thousands died of disease rather than battle. The battle also transformed naval warfare. Until then, many commanders still believed surface fleets with big guns ruled the seas. The Bismarck Sea proved that air power, with its speed, range, and destructive force, could dominate sea lanes and blockade the enemy. From then on, low-level attack and skip bombing tactics spread across the Pacific, from New Guinea to the Philippines and Okinawa. For Kenney's 5th Air Force, the Bismarck Sea marked its defining moment, not just a total victory but a triumph of tactical innovation. Kenney became a hero, immortalized by the slogan, "Hit hard, hit fast, hit low." Paul "Pappy" Gunn, who modified the B-25s, was hailed as the mechanical genius behind the Pacific's miracle weapon. Yet behind the glory lay haunting memories. Some Allied pilots later confessed they were tormented by the sight of firing on helpless Japanese survivors. "I saw them swimming, raising their hands," one said, "but we were ordered to leave no survivors." It was war, but still a nightmare. For Japan, the Bismarck Sea became a symbol of tragedy and despair. The the second day of destiny for the fleet, second only to Midway. But unlike Midway, where they lost carriers, here they lost their lifeblood, the ability to supply their ground forces. After this disaster, no major reinforcements ever reached New Guinea. Japanese forces there were cut off and eventually crushed in the Salamaua-Lai, Huon, and Wewak campaigns. The psychological blow was equally deep. Japanese soldiers in New Guinea, hearing of the convoy's destruction, knew supplies would never come. They would fight and die in the steaming jungles thousands of miles from home. One prisoner later said, "From that day we knew the war was lost. But we fought on for honor." The battle also reshaped Allied views on tactical air power. Before this, B-17s and B-24s were used mainly for high-altitude bombing. After the Bismarck Sea, Kenney proved that medium bombers, properly trained and armed, could strike with far greater precision at low altitude. These tactics were soon adopted in the Philippines campaign and even in Europe. Politically, the victory bolstered American faith in MacArthur's and Nimitz's island-hopping strategy. Congress, impressed by the results, approved major funding increases for air power, B-25s, B-24s, and P-38s. Newspapers hailed the battle as proof that every tax dollar was worth it. In April 1943, the U.S. War Department released a documentary, The Battle of the Bismarck Sea, using actual combat footage. Shown in theaters across the U.S. and Australia, it stunned audiences. For Americans, it was a victory of justice. For the Japanese, a vision of annihilation. Over 80 years later, the Bismarck Sea still holds traces of that day. Beneath the waters off Papua New Guinea rest the wrecks of Kyokusei Maru, Taimei Maru, and Shirayuki, silent tombs for thousands of souls. Divers still find shell casings, helmets, and even bones among the rusted hulls. The sea is calm again, but the past sleeps beneath, a reminder that technology and courage can decide battles, but victory is always paid for in blood. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was more than a tactical triumph. It marked the end of Japan's illusion of invincibility, and the dawn of an era when the skies would decide the fate of the seas. For all who witnessed it, whether victor or vanquished, the memory endures. For in those 2 fiery days of March 1943, the ocean burned, and the world glimpsed the true face of modern war. When the waters of the Bismarck Sea finally cooled beneath the drifting smoke of Japan's shattered ships, the world began to realize that a new era had begun. The battle had lasted barely 2 days, yet its impact rippled through the rest of the Pacific War. For the Allies, this was not merely a military victory, it was irrefutable proof that the sky had become the decisive arena of modern warfare, that the great steel fleets of the previous century were no longer the undisputed masters of the sea. General George C. Kenney later wrote in his memoirs, "We proved what many still doubted, that air power, properly organized, could destroy a naval convoy without the need for a single ship of its own." It was a revolutionary declaration. Since Midway in 1942, the world had witnessed the power of aircraft carriers. But it was at the Bismarck Sea that people saw for the first time that land-based bombers, not just carrier planes, could also dominate the oceans. Strategically, Japan's defeat in the Bismarck Sea was a fatal blow to its ability to supply and reinforce its armies in New Guinea. For months, General Hitoshi Imamura had worked to fortify the strongholds at Lae and Salamaua, key positions meant to halt General Douglas MacArthur's advance toward the Bismarck archipelago. But after the battle, that plan lay in ruins. Almost all the troops destined for Lae were lost at sea. The few survivors were too weak to form any organized resistance. From March 1943 onward, Japan was forced into a defensive posture, conducting only small-scale nighttime transport operations, relying on submarines and coastal barges. That shift handed the initiative entirely to the Allies. MacArthur seized the moment to launch his island-hopping campaign, bypassing Japan's strongholds, seizing key islands, and building airfields to cut enemy supply lines. The victory at the Bismarck Sea thus became the first strategic stepping stone toward fulfilling his famous promise, "I shall return." Before 1943, American bombing doctrine remained divided. The Army Air Forces favored high-altitude precision bombing aimed at industrial or urban targets. Yet in the Pacific, most targets were ships, fast-moving and difficult to hit from above. The Bismarck Sea proved the superiority of low-level attack and skip bombing tactics. The skip bombing technique soon entered official life. U.S. Air Force training manuals and was used throughout the Pacific, from the Solomons to Rabaul and the Philippines. Pilots of B-25s, B-26, and A-20s were trained to fly just above the waves, coordinating with fighters sweeping enemy decks. In Europe, the same concept inspired Britain's Operation Chastise, the 1943 Dam Busters raid on the Ruhr, where special bouncing bombs were designed to strike dam bases. Different contexts, but the same spirit of daring innovation born over the Bismarck Sea. Equally significant was the multi-layered attack coordination pioneered there. High-altitude bombers to distract, medium bombers to disrupt, and low-level attackers to annihilate. This became a model for future joint strike operations, the foundation of modern combined arms warfare. After Bismarck, every major navy was forced to reconsider the role of air power. Japan's navy, still obsessed with the doctrine of the decisive battle fleet, realized that nowhere was safe without air superiority. Subsequent convoys and amphibious operations were confined to darkness, guarded by a few outdated fighters. Reliance on submarines for logistics crippled Japan's operational tempo and supply efficiency. The Allies, in contrast, quickly institutionalized the Bismarck lessons. The U.S. Navy began integrating closely with the Army Air Forces, forming dedicated anti-shipping strike groups, the forerunners of the modern air-sea battle doctrine that later defined Cold War strategy. Even admirals like Chester Nimitz acknowledged that land-based air power was no longer auxiliary. It was an equal partner in maritime warfare. Within the Air Force itself, the victory reinforced a growing conviction: wars could be won primarily from the air. From the Bismarck Sea to the bombing of Tokyo and ultimately to Hiroshima, that line of thinking led directly to the establishment of an independent U.S. Air Force in 1947. Another defining feature of the Bismarck campaign was the role of frontline innovation. Its success did not come from laboratory breakthroughs, but from field ingenuity. Pilots and engineers like Paul "Pappy" Gunn, who re-engineered heavy B-25s into low-flying gunships and perfected seemingly reckless techniques that became doctrine. The U.S. military learned that tactical innovation need not come from high command. It could arise from the cockpit and the hangar floor. This fostered a new military culture, empowering field units to adapt and innovate. After the war, Kenney, by then a strategic advisor, made field innovation one of the central tenets of American air doctrine. But beyond technology, the Bismarck Sea was above all a human victory of courage, discipline, and coordination. Pilots flew mere meters above the water, through smoke and flak, sometimes dodging fragments from their own bombs. With no radar guidance, they relied purely on instinct and training. Their triumph was not just technical, it was proof of human resolve and adaptability under the most extreme conditions. News of the battle electrified the Allied world. Headlines like "Jap convoy wiped out in Bismarck Sea" filled front pages. Combat footage released by the U.S. War Department thrilled audiences in America and Australia, celebrating Kenney's boys as heroes of a new kind of war. In Japan, the government tried to suppress the disaster, but word leaked, sending shockwaves through the military. Many officers called it the worst catastrophe since Midway. Psychologically, the victory shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility. For Allied soldiers, who had endured months of retreats and defeats, this was the first total triumph in the Southwest Pacific, won with minimal losses. The morale surge that followed powered the New Guinea campaign and the broader counteroffensive across the Pacific. When military historians look back on World War II, they often place the Bismarck Sea alongside Midway, Coral Sea, and Leyte Gulf as one of the four defining victories that cemented air power's supremacy at sea. Yet the Bismarck Sea stands apart. It was not a fleet engagement, but an aerial ambush in which an entire enemy convoy was annihilated without a single Allied ship participating. Its legacy extended far beyond the war. The battle inspired the concept of integrated air-sea warfare, later adopted by NATO, the US, and other major powers. Even in Vietnam and the Persian Gulf, echoes of the hit hard, hit low, hit fast doctrine reflected the spirit of Bismarck. In academic circles, it remains a model case study in joint operations, showing how American and Australian air forces combined intelligence, innovation, and precision under extreme time pressure. 80 years later, the numbers, 16 ships sunk, over 3,000 Japanese dead, tell only part of the story. The true meaning of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea lies in the moment the world witnessed a shift of power, from fleets to aircraft, from steel to technology, from brute force to tactical intellect. It marked the turning point of modern warfare. If the early 20th century had belonged to battleships, then from 1943 onward, national power would be measured by wings, radar, and coordination between sky and sea. In that continuum, the Bismarck Sea was where the future took shape. At Port Moresby, after the battle, General Kenney stood before his returning pilots as cheers erupted around him. His voice was hoarse from sleepless nights, but his words were simple. "You've changed the way the world fights wars." And indeed, they had, not with vast armies or armored ships, but with silver wings skimming the sea, carrying the belief that the sky, not the ocean, would decide the fate of the modern world.